What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 37 of the series, and this one is a rather special episode, but also going to be somewhat controversial, even though I don't think it will be as much as I'm anticipating, due to the fact that I already did a Goodreads review on this book that got a lot of discussion. Today, we've finally discussed the novel fondly referred to amongst my friend as the Bird Book, that being The Obscene Bird of Night by José Donoso. This one definitely did not click for me the way that several of my viewers might have hoped that it would, and we'll get into all of that over the course of this video. But before we actually talk about the book, let's discuss some of the structure of this review, because it is going to be similar to the review for The Andromeda Evolution, which was the posthumous sequel to Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, written by Daniel H. Wilson. That review was structured a little bit differently because I was basing a lot of it on my Goodreads review. This one's going to be somewhat similar, so let's talk about that structure. First, I will actually read portions of my Goodreads review and follow up certain sections with clarifications based on some of the discussions with people that I've had about those portions of the book. Then I'll go into some of the more thematic subtextual stuff. There won't be a lot for me to say here, but we'll talk about that when we get there, and then I'll make recommendation of the book after all of that, because I feel like the majority of people watching this that aren't my friends who are expecting this review to come out have not read the book and are wondering about it. And, well, I actually may be thinking completely incorrectly and backwards on that one. I'm pretty sure most of the people who are clicking on this video are the people who have read the book and want discussion on it. Whatever, I've already written all the notes for this review, so we're just going to go with it. First up, let's read sections of my Goodreads review and break some of it down. Now, on part 1 of the book, I really enjoyed the beginning of The Obscene Bird of Night. It had heavy 5-star potential, and the schizophrenic narration enhanced the experience. Because that's kind of one of the main selling points of the book, is just that the narration is kind of crazy, and you have to try to interpret some things as you go, because there are a lot of stuff that are just going to fly over your head if you're not really paying attention, or things that are just going to be confusing otherwise. Some things were a little hard to follow, but it almost always in part 1 came back around on itself in ways that I thought was cool. Chapter 2, I should also note, particularly was very good, but unfortunately it was also where I thought the book peaked. Chapter 2 of this book is incredible. Now, legitimately, I highly enjoy part 1. The narration of the book is indeed absolutely insane, but what part 1 was trying to do in terms of the narrative was only accentuated by the insanity of the narration. It is rather weird, but like I said, everything comes back around in on itself in this first part in ways that I thought was really, really cool. It was nearly as perfect as I could have expected for anything like this book based on my expectations to be, and I really thought that part 1 of The Obscene Bird of Night satisfied what I was hoping to get out of the book. Now on to part 2. The first few chapters are good, similar to part 1, but overall the plot gets really convoluted and unclear, and the schizophrenic narration gets even more schizophrenic and makes the convoluted material feel even more confusing. Part 2 was only 100 pages of the whole book, but I was hate reading the book by the end of part 2 because everything was just too unclear. Yeah, I was definitely not too friendly on this book as a result of part 2. And while brutal, I am being completely honest with my thoughts on this section. The first couple chapters, as a sort of transition into the new thing that the book decided to do in part 2, was fine. I didn't hate it. It was a little bit strange. I was trying to figure out what was going on. But then, sort of, spoiler alert, part 2 jumps like 16 or so years in the past. And this is something that you actually don't really know for sure until into part 3, which we'll get to a little bit later. I said kind of spoiler alert for this point because I actually do recommend that readers who don't know about this know about this going into it, because at least for me, my not knowing that this jumped so far into the past made it impossible to tell when part 2 was taking place and what was going on and what reference points it had, or at least how it behaved in relation to part 1, and this played a huge role in my dislike of this section. I was just very frustrated and confused for pretty much the entirety of part 2, and that's why I was hate reading it by the end of it. This part, primarily due to that timeline change, namely jumping about 16 or so years in the past, was made overly convoluted, by the narration. Like I said, the narration was even more schizophrenic and indiscernible than it already was in the first part. Part one was accentuated by that. Part two is definitely hindered by it. It definitely tipped me over the edge because the fact that it was not clear with anything and the narration just did not work for me in this section. Now we jump to part three. Where is that at? There we go. Part 3 brought things mostly back together. Mostly. Some sections of this are comparable to Part 1, but there was a lot of bloat in things happening that I thought just did not matter. So I'm sure that a lot of it mattered thematically, but not in any way that I grasped on a first read. Like, seriously, why should I care about these women in the casa betting away everything that they own to Inez, including the clothes on their backs? Like, why was this board game section of the book? I think it was somewhere around 100 pages of the entire novel. I can see the board game itself being symbolism, and I can see some thematic relevance in the entire section, I'm sure, but it wasn't enough to drag me away from the boredom of it. And also, just as I sort of hinted at it while talking about part two, there were a couple chapters in the section that did clear up most of my problems with part two, but that doesn't retroactively change the fact that I hated reading part two while I was reading it, unfortunately. So yeah, a few things to comment specifically. So first of all, yeah, the plot did pretty much nothing in part 3 for the most part, which would be fine. I don't necessarily have to have a lot of plot things happening. Character stuff or even thematic material can be enough for me to enjoy sections of a book, even if the plot doesn't go anywhere. But not for a first-time reader personally reading this, who doesn't tend to study themes and subtext on a first go-around. That's not something that I'm looking for, and tends to be something that flies over my head until I actually understand the basis of what's going on. And furthermore, yeah, it does make part 2 somewhat more acceptable to me retroactively. Somewhere in this book it is revealed that part 2 is around 16 years prior. That's why I mentioned that while discussing part 2. I think it's important to know that so that when you get to part 2, you're not as lost as I was, and hopefully not getting as frustrated as I did. A lot of part 3 in total just comes down to being too long for me with pretty much nothing to show for it. When it comes right down to it, part 1 I thought was great. It was 4 stars easily, possibly even 5 in terms of what it was actually trying to do and the way that it executed on that. Part 2 was horrible to me while I was reading it, even if I don't hate it as much in retrospect. So like 1 star while I was reading it, 2 stars in retrospect. I just did not enjoy part 2 at all. And then part 3 was fully serviceable, like 3 stars. So not horrible, but also not great. It was just too long. Now moving on in the review where I talk about some of the more general stuff. In regards to the gross and disturbing material, it was severely overhyped. I was led to believe I'd be gagging and wanting to vomit at various sections of this book. The beginning of chapter 8 was about as bad as it got. All the other gross stuff didn't really get any real reactions from me at all, major or not major. They just weren't that graphic to me. I was expecting a heck of a lot worse than anything that ever happens here in the book, besides the beginning of chapter 8, which was really weird, but not vomiting levels of weird. At least it wasn't that type of gross, in my opinion. There was plenty of cool stuff overall in The Obscene Bird of Night, and lots of potential, but beyond part 1, it just didn't do a whole lot for me. And the end was just so underwhelming and disappointing compared, again, to what I had been led to expect. Also some cool symbolism, alongside a cool 2 to 3 pages of really anxious reading in the very end, but not much more to note on that front. And yeah, this pretty much summarizes the general idea of how I felt about the book in terms of reviewing it. I was underwhelmed by what I got and didn't get what I was told I would get. Let's talk about some of the themes and subtext. Here's the deal. Cobby would be upset with me for not mentioning a couple of these things because he is somebody who looks into theme and subtext and all that special stuff reading books. Because when it comes right down to it, a lot of why I read is for an actual story, and if I'm reading for anything deeper than the story, I have to enjoy the story first before I go into that deeper stuff, and the deeper stuff I tend to go into on a subsequent read. I don't have any right to talk about the themes and the subtext in The Obscene Bird of Night. I don't pay attention, like I said, to themes and subtext on a first read most of the time. First reads are about the characters, the world, the plot, in some cases, some of the philosophy. But in this case, I struggled with the book as it is, just straight up, that I just couldn't find myself able to focus on the rest of it. I know that the book deals a lot with identity and other thematic, that's not the word, and other similar thematic overtones, or maybe undertones, depending on how you see it, and the writing style of the book has a lot to do with these themes and the subtext. But I can't really comment beyond what I've already said in the review. With these kinds of things, I'd be able to actually study and dig into them a little bit more on a reread, but who knows when or if that would ever happen. So, would I recommend The Obscene Bird of Night, and will I ever reread it? Well, let's answer the second question first. Like I mentioned, the answer is if I either run out of other things I'd prefer to read instead, or if I spontaneously desire to reread it out of nowhere, like just unexpectedly, sure, I'll reread it. I don't have anything against the idea of rereading it because I'm sure I'd actually enjoy it a little bit more on the reread than I did this first time. I think it would be worth it for the purpose of getting out a little bit more from the themes and all of that material than I did this first time, because it's pretty apparent that a lot of that has a pretty major impact on the so-called quality of the book. Now, in terms of recommendation, I'd say no. I don't recommend reading the Bird book to most people. Just in terms of what people are looking for, the Bird book is going to satisfy a very small subset of people, and even the people it does satisfy, it's not necessarily going to be like loving it the way that Kabi does, for instance. There are going to be very few people who really get the most out of this, especially on a first read. But on the other hand, if you have any interest in or enjoyment of magical realism as a genre, particularly Latin American magical realism, because this is where that comes from, it's Chilean magical realism, yes, I will recommend that you read this, because if that's something that you enjoy, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't enjoy this. But if that's not something you enjoy, this book's not going to change your mind. In fact, I would actually recommend reading Master and Margarita as a magical realism book before reading this one. The main thing is, if you don't enjoy magical realism, there's no chance that you're going to read this and your opinion on magical realism is just going to change. I just don't see that being a thing. And otherwise, if you have any other interest in the book beyond what I've just said, sure, go ahead and give it a shot. I don't have anything against people trying to read it. It is worth reading if you have the stomach for it, but it's not like a necessity. It's not something that I would say, hey, put this on your TBR. If you want to, go ahead. I'm not going to say that you should. But I will finish off this video review with the last 3 paragraphs of my Goodreads review to finalize my thoughts on it, because I thought that I did a rather good job in the actual written review. So sure, maybe my expectations led me to be disappointed, but I blame that partially on the people nagging me to read this every day for a couple months before I actually got around to it. And this is an important point that I really want to make clear. It's not even that I had high expectations for the Bird book either. It was that my expectations were focused in all of the wrong places because of where the hype was at. This is a very important point. If you're going into this book expecting for it to be absolutely gross and disturbing and disgusting, that's not what you're going to get. That's not what this book is. There are some scenes where you're going to get some of that out of it, but that's not what it is overall. So what I ended up getting out of the book, strangely, was a very different experience than what I expected, and that colored my overall experience a bit more than maybe I wish it did. I'd still say it's worth most people reading, as long as they're in the mood for something very unique, like magical realism, with a narration style unlike any other I've ever encountered, and I guess as long as you have a strong stomach, because maybe there are people more sensitive to gross stuff than I ended up being. At least I was so overhyped to the gross stuff that what I got just didn't compare to what I was expecting. Like I said, a lot of it comes from the fact that my expectations were in weird places. The book was mostly enjoyable and definitely required a bit of brain power, unlike most of my typical reads, so I appreciated that about the book, and I guess it was fun in a way, but I was just left wanting so much more while also wishing that the book was like, honestly, 75 to 100 pages shorter. So yeah, that concludes the video for the most part. It's a little bit of a more openly clarified version of my Goodreads review. I already had a dozen plus likes on that Goodreads review, and who knows how many will watch this video, probably only a few of my friends, and that's almost assuredly it. I'm not going to expect for anything more than that. Hopefully it didn't sound too much like hounding on the book, but I just wasn't huge onto the book. I rated it 3 stars on Goodreads, but here's a little bit more of the breakdown, I guess. If it were just part 1, I'd easily rate this 4 stars, possibly 5. So I'd probably give it a 4 on Goodreads and say this was 4.5. If it were just parts 1 and 2, I would probably say 2 stars. As it stands, the only reason why it is 3 stars is because part 1 was so good, otherwise it would just be 2 for me. That concludes this video. Check out seasonalproductions.com, as always, for all of my YouTube and writing content in all one place. I'll be back again next week with my actual final Dark Tower related video. Sorry for another one, guys, but I felt like I needed to do it, so I'll see you guys then. Thank you for watching.